George Polwitz is a New York City businessman who's worked for the same company now for nearly 30 years. And every day at exactly 11:45 a.m., George leaves his office on the 24th floor of the One Vanderbilt Center in Midtown Manhattan, and he walks to one of several local eateries where he enjoys lunch while reading a paper that he's picked up at a newsstand along the way. Some years ago, being a good Christian man, George started the practice every Wednesday of buying 2 lunches, one for himself, which he would enjoy in the restaurant, and another that he would ask the waitstaff to wrap up in a to-go box. And as George left the restaurant on Wednesday, he would head back to his office, all the while scouring the New York City streets for someone who appeared they could use a good meal. Sometimes that was somebody standing at a bus stop or sitting on a park bench. But more often than not, the person identified themselves because there were many along George's route who sat on the street holding signs asking for donations or work or food. And so George very unassumingly would approach the person, place the bag of food at their feet, and then always whisper a prayer over them, "God bless." This was generosity in George's mind. It was a way he shared what he had, his blessings, with others. And it was as much a part of his spiritual routine and rhythm as going to church every Sunday or praying the daily office. That is until the day George met Solomon. Solomon was standing at the corner of 44th and Park Avenue, and he was playing his harmonica loudly. So loudly that he didn't even notice when George approached him, placing his bag of food in the box that sat in front of Solomon, which read, "Anything helps." He did, however, stop playing abruptly when he heard that prayer whispered, "God bless." He wanted to respond, and so Solomon turned in the direction of the voice towards George, and he responded in his bold voice, "God bless you, brother. Won't you stay and sit with me for a moment while I enjoy what you've shared?" Well, at that moment, George froze because that wasn't a part of the ritual. And in an instant, a dissonance so powerful, so unfamiliar overcame George. He looked around. He grew incredibly anxious. His mind was reeling, even though he wasn't sure what all he was taking account of here. Was this safe? Would anyone who knew him see him? Would he stand out like a sore thumb sitting on a street curb in a business suit in the middle of the afternoon? He fidgeted nervously with his watch. Did he have time for this? What would they talk about? And could he get out of the conversation once it started if it wasn't going well? In this moment, George's sense of generosity was suddenly and disruptively being challenged. And I begin with this parable this morning because as we've been exploring the creation of rules within the Christian community, or these guiding Christ-like qualities that unite us as a people who are living as a remnant in a world that so often values and prioritizes things very different than we do, I've been thinking a lot about the rule of generosity and about the power that a group of truly generous Christians might have in influencing and impacting its community. The problem, I think, though, is that so often we, like George, have a misunderstanding of what true generosity looks like, of what it means to be a truly generous people. And so this affects our ability to have the kind of impact God desires us to have in the places and spaces we inhabit in this world. Far too often we confuse generosity for benevolence or kindness. And so like George, we do a good deed, we share of our excess, and then we call it generosity. But when we limit generosity to simple compassion or charity, we inevitably fail to understand the spiritually forming nature of generosity. We fail to comprehend its theological significance and expression. And so Paul addresses this in his second letter to the church at Corinth. I should tell you that just prior to Paul's writing of this letter, we know that he was engaged in a a capital campaign of sorts, if you will. He had been raising funds from Gentile believers for Jewish Christians who were living in Jerusalem and who had fallen on hard times, probably due to Roman persecution. And there are all kinds of theories about why Paul took up this ministry of fundraising in the first place, but most will tell you this was likely one of Paul's acts of church unity, because there were still a lot of rough edges in the relationship between Jewish and Gentile believers at this point. We know from Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth that he started this fundraising campaign with the Corinthians. And yet over time, somewhere along the way, the Corinthians' giving had dried up. Their motivation to give had dwindled. And so Paul engages this topic as he writes the church a second time. But we quickly see that he's not just talking about church unity here, or altruism, or compassion. He begins by celebrating another group of Gentile Christians who were located in Macedonia. And this was perhaps a peculiar tactic, because everybody knew one thing about the Macedonian church. They were poor. They had nothing. And by Paul's own account here, he tells the Corinthians that the Macedonians aren't just poor, they've fallen on some really hard times. So it was the poor getting poorer. And yet, despite these realities, Paul attests to this unusual and spirited desire the Macedonians have to participating in caring for the needs of the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. Paul says, I didn't ask them to get involved with this. They themselves asked to be a part of it. They begged, is the word he used, to get on board with this. We can't imagine such a thing. Now, there are some who have claimed over history's course that Paul's reporting of the Macedonians' enthusiasm here was a strategic maneuver, that the Corinthians were a bit of a competitive people. And so this was Paul's way of proverbially poking the bear a bit, thinking that maybe by poking that bear, he could stimulate a little giving out of a rather affluent group of people who had fallen off the giving bandwagon. But I think given the larger landscape of what was going on in the first century church, this probably wasn't some youth group fundraising tactic Paul was employing, where he was pitting the red team against the blue team and hoping by celebrating one group's accomplishment, he could get the other group on board. I think what Paul was doing here is testifying to a true manifestation of spirit-led generosity in the lives of the Macedonian church. He's articulating that this group's sacrificial collection of goods and gifts for the Jewish believers is an expression of the gospel itself, that this was evidence of the Macedonians' deep faith in Jesus Christ manifested in tangible expression. And because Paul sincerely loves the Corinthians, he wants them also to continue growing in their journey with Christ. And so he deeply desires them to re-engage their giving towards the Christians in Jerusalem as a way of reaffirming their faith in Jesus and receiving an ongoing work of sanctifying grace that he believes God wants to continue doing in and among them. So Paul's calling the Corinthians here to give, not because he's worried about meeting a financial quota or some kind of monetary goal, but because he believes that their giving would be an expression of surrender of themselves to God. Now, isn't it just like Paul to take something as simple as the collection of an offering and make it theological? You all think we complicate things here at College Church a lot. Paul was the master. But he knows how the gospel of Christ has changed the lives of the Corinthians up to this point. When he first got to Corinth, this was a people deeply immersed in sexual immorality, and they were divided by all sorts of misunderstandings stemming from their multiculturalism. And yet the message of Jesus Christ's forgiveness and reconciliation had radically transformed them. And Paul knew that God had ongoing work yet to do amongst these folks. And so he shares about what's happening in Macedonia, reminding the Corinthians that the greatest expression of God's grace in a person's life isn't found in giving towards another person, but rather in the way that giving articulates a joyful and uncontainable response to the gospel. Generosity then has to be something greater than just the giving or passing along of that which we could live without. Because what we don't read here is a bunch of explicit instructions from Paul about what we should give. He's not reporting exactly how much the Macedonians had given compared to others, and he wasn't prescribing to the Corinthians an exact percentage that he believed they should be able to contribute toward the Jerusalem Christians' cause. Again, benevolence, charity, piety, tithing, that's not Paul's point here. The focus of this letter is generosity, according to Paul, and the posture behind generosity is what matters most. The posture of generosity is what should motivate our giving. Hearts and lives that are rooted in an understanding of the grace of Jesus Christ, who generously gave everything on behalf of others. And this, according to Paul, is what the Macedonians understood. They had an understanding of the grace of God in Jesus Christ, which brought them unexplainable joy in spite their terrible earthly conditions. And this joy naturally led them then to a response of generosity, giving whatever they had, though it not be much, not out of obligation or duty, but as the only suitable response to Jesus that they could imagine. A sharing of the very grace that they themselves had received by God. Isn't that beautiful? Why on earth then is it so dang hard? That's what I want to know as I read this. A few of you are nodding. You think it's hard too? And the reality is, just like the Corinthians, we as 21st century North Americans have a similar challenge. We have so much. And sometimes those who have so much have the hardest time being generous. There are many in the world today who have far less than we do, like the Macedonians, who are much quicker to part with what they have on behalf of others. You may have seen some of the statistics on this. I'll warn you in advance. It's not real encouraging. But in the last few years, it's been reported that the North American church, North American Christians on average give something like 2.5% of their income. If you think that sounds bad, please note that that number was 3.3% during the Great Depression. I'll cool it with the statistics, because the goal here this morning isn't to guilt us into generosity. That's actually not a thing. But clearly we have a challenge, and the question is why? What are the hurdles we face in being truly generous, and how might our church and our community, our neighborhoods, our homes, our workspaces, how would these places be different if we could overcome these challenges and really live by the rule of generosity? I've been wondering about that this week, and I've come up with a few challenges that, at least to me, seem very obvious. For starters, I think we struggle in our world to live with an abundant mindset. Paul says that God will generously provide all you need and plenty left over to share with others. God will provide all you need and then plenty to share with others. What a wonderful promise. We prayed this earlier. We believe this, we proclaim it, and yet so often we then live in a scarcity mindset. I think this is largely due to cultural norms. It seems we are encouraged at every turn to keep enough, not just for a rainy day, but for the next major global crisis that seems inevitable. Do you remember Y2K? And then there was that whole toilet paper fiasco during the pandemic. We become irrational, to say the least, in our worry when we even consider the possibility of not having enough. And frankly, this gets a little out of control. We go so far as to think things like, what will we do without our favorite breakfast cereal or sensitive skin body wash? Those are ridiculous examples, I realize. And I would never go so far as to say we shouldn't be good stewards who save as well as give. I believe that's what we're called to do. But you have to admit, we have a tendency to take this mentality to an extreme. And so we stock up in every imaginable way. And in so doing, we are subliminally internalizing that it's more important for us to be prepared for what could be than help someone who's dealing with what really is. And that does not breed generosity in our lives. I think the scarcity mindset also often limits our understanding and expression of generosity to just money. And so we hit a rough financial streak and we say, well, I got to jump out of the generosity lane here for a little bit while I get back on my feet. But Paul tells us that true generosity is expressed in many forms. Money is just one of those forms. And again, for us here in our context, sometimes that's an easy form. It's the thing we can throw at a problem most readily. But an abundance mindset reaches further into the realm of generosity, and it asks, what about the sharing of my time, my experience, my stories, my life? True generosity that is rooted in joy seeks to share anything and everything of value as a response to God's grace. True generosity, rooted in joy, seeks to share anything and everything of value as a response to God's grace. Secondly, I think our culture of entitlement and selfishness is another hurdle that we face in terms of embracing the truly generous life. Now, we could sit on this one for a while because I think there's all sorts of manifestations of how this plays out in our lives. But for me, I've been thinking a lot about attitude. Think about the ways that we allow others' response to God's grace to determine our own response and what that should look like. So sure, I'll participate in the community cleanup day so long as I see others in the neighborhood are signing up to participate. Or maybe we look around a room this size and think, well, this is a big church. There's a lot of people here and I volunteered last time. It's somebody else's turn. Rather than asking the Spirit, listening for a prompting as to if this is the response to God's grace that we should offer again. Personally, this obstacle to generosity shows up even when I agree to act generously, but then my attitude doesn't reflect an accompanying spirit of generosity. So you have a coworker who asks you, hey, can you take me to my auto mechanic during lunch? And with a smile, you say, sure, I can do that. And then you sulk about it all morning because you realize now you're not going to get a lunch hour. And you wish they would have asked somebody else. But true generosity, rooted in joy, seeks to share anything and everything, attitude included, anything and everything of value as a response to God's grace. Thirdly, I think we struggle with generosity because we want to be acknowledged for or lay claim to the gift that we offer. Ugh. This one's tough for me because if we view generosity as our response to God's grace in life, it seems somewhat appropriate that we would want to lay claim to this response. This is our offering of praise, right? But Paul tells us that God is the one who provides seed for the farmer and then bread to eat. And in the same way, he will provide and increase our resources and then produce a great harvest of generosity in us. So this isn't about us making an investment in a ministry that we think could be fruitful so long as they do it the way we think they should. It's not about serving in a volunteer position so long as you only have to do the tasks that you enjoy doing. It's a giving back to God that which is already his. It's a full relinquishing of the offering, a surrendering of the gift, the commitment to serve, the offer to show up, the sharing of the story, the giving of the gift, stating, I no longer hold claim to this. I no longer have right to take credit for it or speak into its use in any way. This one I saw playing out a few years back. My family had a very loose connection to a church that went through a horrible thing. They had a staff person who embezzled some money. It was a lot of money, actually. And so this church went through a season of deep hurt and struggle. They were frankly kind of stuck as to how to move on. And so I attended a congregational meeting as a prayer supporter. I sat in the back and was just there to offer my prayers, asking God to help this congregation move forward. And I watched as the pastor opened up the meeting, expressing where things stood. There had been an arrest made in the case, and the perpetrator was awaiting trial. And at this meeting, a congregation member stepped up to the microphone, and he wanted to express something. He said, "Pastor, what are we going to do to make sure that this guy gets the full punishment of the law and that we get our money back?" I thought, oof, how's this pastor going to respond? He didn't have to, though, because a woman from the congregation stepped up, quiet woman from the back, and she stepped up to the microphone and asked for permission to respond, which the pastor wisely allowed her to. And she said, "When we gave our offerings at the altar, we released them to God. And while there has been a terrible offense made here against God in this crime, this is not our battle to fight. This money is no longer ours. It was given to the Lord, and we need to move forward, trusting that He will deal with the issue. But our job is to generously move forward." Wow. It was a reminder to me that the generous life lays its offering at the altar of God and lets go. It doesn't seek to micromanage the earthly leaders entrusted to steward the gifts, or think it knows better how things should be done or organized or spent, because again, true generosity, rooted in joy, seeks to share anything and everything of value as a response to God's grace. I'll mention one more. I think generosity is also challenging to us because we so often forget that true generosity is rooted in a desire to testify to the ongoing work of Jesus Christ in our lives. Paul told the Corinthians that generosity is cyclical, that it's infectious, if you will. And so a person who gives from a truly generous spirit will firstly be inspired to continue being generous, and then secondly, impact others who will also join in the response to God's grace. They will also become generous. Now, hear me out. What I'm not saying here is that Paul is teaching prosperity theology. He's not saying that if you give, you'll get. No. He's teaching that the virtue of true generosity by the power of the Holy Spirit in us is perpetual, that it's self-propagating, that it continually grows. And so as we respond to God's grace in our lives with generosity, we gain this ever-expanding and ever-enriching understanding of the depths of God's grace. And that then stimulates a greater and greater sense of response. So we're always attempting to express our joyful and uncontainable reply to the ongoing work of God in new and more profound ways. And in this, we see this continual and ever-growing sense that, maybe we can say this together, true generosity, rooted in joy, seeks to share anything and everything of value as a response to God's grace. I don't think I believe you. Let's try it again. One more time, put it up there. True generosity, rooted in joy, seeks to share anything and everything of value as a response to God's grace. Well done. Friends, if you've been sitting here this morning thinking, oh boy, a message on generosity, they're gonna pass the plates, then I fear you've missed the point altogether. Frankly, this is one of the most generous churches I've ever heard of. I got curious on Friday, and so I started doing a little digging around. Did you know that last year, this church gave almost $125,000 to other ministries? This doesn't include benevolence offerings or relief funds that we collected for when there was a disaster in some part of the world and we wanted to partner with somebody that had boots on the ground in that area. This is in addition to that. And this is in addition to our regular operational budget, and a capital campaign to help build a facility across the way at JC Body Shop that will be more accessible to our church and our community. This is in addition to that. So this church is incredibly giving with its resources, to say the least. We could go on and on about the number of people here who give of their time and their intentionality in building relationships with teachers and students at Francis Slocum Elementary School as mentors and encouragers year after year. It's remarkable. We have people who come into this building every week and give of their attention and their devotion to help others discern God's activity in their lives through Well Springs of Freedom and through spiritual direction. There's a group from this church every Sunday afternoon who goes into the nursing homes in this community, and they keep members of College Church who can no longer come here every Sunday connected to our body. They just go and visit with them. They continue to build that relationship, and they are incredibly giving of their time and attention. And we could go on and on about the people who serve in Splash every week and those who serve as greeters or trustees or board members. Fill in the blank. There is giving and giving and giving. And so my hope and my prayer here is that these acts of giving come from truly generous hearts. That's the point this morning. That these are joyful responses to God's grace in our life and desires to testify to the gospel of Jesus, who is still at work in us. So this morning, my goal is simply to encourage us. Let's keep growing in generosity. Let's embrace this as a rule in our community. And let's keep asking, where could my response to God be more rooted in joy and better reflect my response to God's grace in my life? For some of us, that will mean being intentional about taking on an abundant mindset, about daily recognizing God has given me enough for today and enough that I can share with others. Others of us might need to reflect on our attitudes about giving. Perhaps we need to ask ourselves, are we offering our time and our gifts ourselves with a spirit of humility and joy? Or are we just going through the motions, doing it because we know it's what we should do, but not having truly generous spirits about our giving? Maybe this morning, some of us need to ask God to help us fully surrender the things that we're giving, to make our responses to God's grace without any condition, without any strings attached, and recognize that in relinquishing control of the gift, that's as much a part of the offering and generosity as any gift itself could ever be. And I wonder if some of us, like George, need to consider today what limits or parameters we've put on our generosity. Maybe we need to ask ourselves, have we capped what we're willing to give in order to express our response to God's grace? What areas of my life are off limits? And how might we ask God to help us engage those areas of giving in order that generosity might truly become the fruit of grace in our lives?